Greetings. I'm Ed Steinfeld, Director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Welcome to our special event on the Russia-Ukraine crisis, perspectives from Kyiv, Moscow, and Brussels. Obviously, this is an extraordinarily important topic for our times and will continue to be an important topic, I'm sure, for time to come. This event has really been the brainchild of and will be moderated by my terrific colleague, Lyle Goldstein, visiting professor here at the Watson Institute. I'll turn it over to Lyle in just a moment to introduce the panel, but let me say a word about Lyle first. Lyle, in addition to his role here at Watson, is the Director of Asian Engagement at the security-focused think tank Defense Priorities. As many of you know, Lyle previously had served for 20 years as a research professor at the U.S. Naval War College. He's a phenomenal expert on both Russian and Chinese foreign and defense policy. He's the author of numerous articles and monographs, all of which have educated me. I'll just call out specifically his 2015 book, Meeting China Halfway, How to Diffuse the Emerging U.S.-China Rivalry. Today's session will be run as a webinar. Lyle is going to moderate a discussion among our three panelists, whom I'll introduce in just a moment, but then we're going to open this up to questions. You all in the audience are welcome to ask your questions, write your questions, please, in the Q&A window at the bottom of the Zoom window, and Lyle will be sure to see those questions. So with that, let me thank the entire panel. Thank you, Lyle, and let me turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ed, and thanks for supporting this important effort here. Good afternoon, everyone. I do wish we were meeting under happier circumstances. I think this crisis really has us all very, very anxious for the future of Europe and indeed for our whole world. But the latest news is actually good. If you've been following the crisis for the last 24 hours, we've actually had some signs that the crisis may be receding. So this is great. And although by no means I think are we out of the woods. We'll see what our panelists make of these latest developments. As Ed Steinfeld said, I'm usually wearing a China hat, but occasionally wearing a Russia hat, as I am today. I'm at Watson studying great power rivalry. I've spent a lot of time in Russia, and my latest visit to Russia was actually during the North Korea crisis in late 2017. I was in Vladivostok, quite an interesting place. As well as discussing North Korea, we spent a good amount of time in Vladivostok chatting about the Ukraine issue. So this is not new on our plate, as it were. But I'm also completely fascinated by Eastern Europe, and it's of such great importance. I made a couple of trips to the small country of Moldova in 2019, 2020, and boy, is that a fascinating country. One of 6 countries besides Russia that have a border with Ukraine. And you can imagine the people in Moldova and all of those countries that border Ukraine are watching very closely to see what is happening. But extraordinary in Moldova, how much the situation there resembles Ukraine in many ways. So this is fascinating for me personally, and I'll be very interested to see how our panel appraises this crisis. So we're so thrilled today to have some of the leading experts from the region to help us understand this. And I've told them to help us through this by going through some basics as well. But really, we have some of the world's leading experts. So let me introduce the panel, and then we'll go straight into the substance. But we have Volodymyr Ishchenko, who is a research associate at Institute of East European Studies at the Freie University in Berlin. He's also working on a book about the Maidan uprising. And we're very pleased to have him here. By the way, he educated and I think also teaching in Kyiv for a long time. So I think we're not too far off in saying we have a perspective from Kyiv. Theresa Fallon, she is founder and director of the Center for Russia, Europe, and Asia Studies. Also a senior fellow at Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and teaches occasionally at the Marshall Center for Security studies in Garmisch, an important center, but very influential player in Brussels and for how Europe sees these critical issues. And lastly, we have Dmitry Suslov, who's Deputy Director for the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies, and also Senior Lecturer at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. So we're thrilled to have this diverse panel here. We're really looking to penetrate to beyond the headlines. Now we'll be covering some really controversial issues, and moreover, it's not surprising that people are, quite emotional about these issues right now. After all, there's been a lot of talk of war over the last month or two. But I will ask people to be polite and respectful, and that includes the people asking questions. And we'll also ask people to be concise and succinct so that we can move the discussion along. But let me begin, if you will. We'll do this kind of interview style without presentations, and I'm asking the presenters to keep their remarks under, to 3 or 4 minutes, let's say. Got my timer here. But let's start with Volodymyr, if that's okay. And want to start with a very basic question. Just, Volodymyr, how do you see the origins of the crisis?
Thank you, Lyle, for the presentation and for letting me to start this very interesting panel. First, speaking about the origins, it's important to clearly articulate what's actually going on. And in my vision, there are 2 autonomous processes that we are observing. These processes are autonomous, but of course they are interacting and self-reinforcing and mutually reinforcing each other. So the first process is a Russian coercive diplomacy. The second process is the US and UK officials and media campaign about the Russian imminent invasion. And as I emphasize this, for example, the media campaign cannot be treated as simply an objective reflection of Russian actions or Russian plans and so on. But speaking about Russian coercive diplomacy, it's of course partially about NATO and all the security issues that have been a lot discussed. But I think what is much less discussed, but may play quite important role, is how the Ukrainian politics turned under Zelensky, and especially in the last year, and what happened with Zelensky's starting to use sanctions against the opposition. And the first target of the sanctions was Viktor Medvedchuk, who is considered to be one of the most pro-Russian politicians in Ukraine and a personal friend of Putin. And he was sanctioned last year together with TV stations that are connected to him. And this could be the moment when Putin could understand that there could be no kind of like peaceful way to turn Ukrainian politics in a way, at least a little bit more friendly towards Russia. And this is, I think it's very much underestimated. And speaking about the media campaign in the US, driven by US and UK officials, feeding very generously the statements that sometimes sounds plausible, but very often sound like completely outlandish for the people who live in Ukraine, in Russia, specifically about the weather factor in Russian invasion, that just shameful. And I just recall how it was like in 2014 with Russian propaganda feeding the news about crucified boys. And what I observed in the last 3 months is it's something of the same scale of misinformation. And what drives it, I think it's not simply Russian actions, but some processes in US and UK domestic politics, maybe attempts to pressure on Germany about the Nord Stream 2, the pipeline between Russia and Germany. And these are the things that I believe may have an important role in the current crisis, but are quite underestimated.
Okay, thanks very much for those thoughts. And I want to come back to you on the next round and ask you also about to reflect a little bit on the legacy of the Maidan events and all of that, how that's impacting people in Kyiv, how they're thinking about this. But let's go to Theresa. Can you give us the view from Brussels? How do you see this? How did this come about? Why is this happening now?
Okay, first of all, thank you so much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you today. Many people think of this in regard to NATO, but we should remember the roots of what happened back in 2014 at the Maidan and with President Viktor Yanukovych, because he had agreed to sign an EU agreement for closer alignment. And then President Putin offered him another deal. And he was kind of sitting on the fence trying to choose between the two, West or Russia. And then ultimately he chose to go with Russia. Then we saw the Maidan erupt. So this is kind of a continuation of all of this struggle. So in 2014, we saw the annexation of Crimea, of course, but this has never really been settled, about which area is Ukraine going to go in? And this is kind of an unsettled dispute. Now, people in the media are emphasizing NATO because this is part of President Putin's two treaties that he pitched with maximalist demands to really rewrite the post-Cold War order in Europe. And I think that there seems to be a focus on Ukraine, but I mean, if you examine everything he's asked for, it's quite massive. And everyone, not everyone, but many people at NATO felt that these were such maximalist claims that this would be used as an excuse to do something in Ukraine. But there's also another school of thought thinking he wants to see what he's going to get. And it's also kind of a stress test for the EU and for NATO, and to see how they respond, where they line up. And so you have the big countries like Germany, France. Germany obviously has this interesting relationship, very complex relationship with Russia, Ostpolitik, their traditional kind of looking eastwards. And we have in the middle of all of this, the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which is a pipeline that goes directly from Russia to Germany, rather through the other route of going through Ukraine. There was shrinkage, it was expensive. And so having this direct pipeline for German industry seems to be what the Germans wanted. And so they've also given money to Ukraine to try to offset this lack of finance that they were going to get from transit fees, because this gas will no longer go through Ukraine through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So early on, we've seen sanctions, and then the Biden administration lifted them. Some wonder about the timing on that. So in Europe, it's a complex landscape. And as the former president of Estonia noted, that we will see where everyone is lining up. So you have Central Eastern European countries naturally fearful of Russia because they're closer to it. And then you have other countries, for example, like Spain, farther away. They don't see it as such a threat. And then you have the big players like France and Germany. This is also an election year in France. So you have Macron, who also holds the rotating French Council presidency. So for 6 months, he gets to set the agenda for Europe. And he's really driving the strategic autonomy debate. So this crisis is happening at a time when Europe is supposed to be talking about strategic autonomy, when many realize that they need NATO, that they're really not able to stand up to this challenge. So this has morphed. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. That should be clear to the audience. And so therefore there's no Article 5 that would mean that if anything should happen in Ukraine, NATO troops would go there. There is no agreement to do that. So there's been a movement for reassurance. So sending some troops to Central Eastern on the eastern flank kind of reassure them, because you have Poland, you have Romania, they all share a border. And so the biggest fear now, I think, in Europe is, of course, war, but also there would be a need to pre-position supplies for refugee flows. They're expecting, millions of refugees flooding in, and we know what that how that affects politics in Europe as well. That previous refugee flows tenterhooks. We see this kind of escalation, dialogue, and they had hoped to have de-escalation. Now, from right before this meeting, I checked, and there's discussion that they were de-escalating by moving troops out, but others have said, using satellite details, that that's not really happening. So there's been a whole diplomatic advance. You've had President Macron go to Moscow, meetings with Putin. So this was something that the Europeans really, he felt very proud. He was kind of asserting his strategic autonomy, but it seems that just about no leader who visits Moscow is treated well. And so Macron was guaranteed that there would be no de-escalation, and that turned out to be not true. The ships were in the Black Sea. There was also the exercises in Belarus. They tried to spin it to the French presidential handlers, tried to spin it saying he knew all that was going to happen, but he meant after that there would be no more escalation. So I think that we saw also with Liz Truss from the UK when she visited with Lavrov, her counterpart, she was, humiliated. They asked her if she would support Russian soldiers in Rostov-on-Don, which is really part of Russia. So it was kind of a gotcha question. And so she was
I saw some of that, and I was watching the optics on the Schultz visit also, and there seemed to be a lot of tension in the room there. But Theresa, if you don't mind, let's move to Dmitry, but we'll come right back to you shortly. But thank you there. That's a very good survey of the landscape from Brussels' perspective. Okay, Dmitry, how about you? What do you think? Where does what are the fundamental origins of this crisis we're seeing?
Well, I think that we're dealing with a combination of two factors, the fundamental factor and the Ukraine factor. The origins of the fundamental factor go back to early 1990s, the beginning of NATO enlargement and Russian systemic and fundamental dissatisfaction with NATO enlargement. I recall Boris Yeltsin, the first Russian president, talking in 1994 about cold peace replacing the Cold War due to the enlargement of NATO. And Russia has been trying to struggle against NATO enlargement over the last 25 years. And there is basically nothing new in the Russian security demands and in the objections against the enlargement of NATO, in Russian desire to indeed establish the rules and principles and the architecture of the European security, which Russia considers justified and fair for itself, to overcome this pattern, the momentum of the NATO and the US victory in the Cold War, simultaneously meaning the defeat of Russia. What is new today, talking about this fundamental factor, is that Russian leadership now perceives that it can achieve something that Russia has been failing to achieve over the last 30 years, namely a revision of the rules of the European security system. And the reason is the Biden administration and the policies of the Biden administration, namely prioritization of China, not Russia, as the major adversary, strategic adversary and competitor of the United States, and the willingness of the United States to focus and concentrate their resources and attention to the containment of China, and thus the US desire to overcome escalation with Russia. Right, and from the Russian perspective, facing China and being interested in focusing on China, Biden administration might show more flexibility at the front, which it perceives peripheral. So that's the more fundamental problem. The Ukraine problem is basically Russian conclusion And here I fully agree with Vladimir Ishenko. Yes, indeed, Russia got seriously dissatisfied with Zelensky, but this is broader than Zelensky. Basically, the time or the policies that Zelensky government started to conduct made Russia conclude that the only way to compel Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreements in particular, according to which Ukraine should amend its constitution, become more decentralized country, etc., etc. And more broadly, the only way to accomplish the transformation of Ukraine, which Russia wants, is to change the Western policy. That without a certain pressure from the West, without the message and compellence from the West, Ukraine by itself will not change in the way how Russia thinks Ukraine should change. And it doesn't matter whether it is Zelensky, Poroshenko, or there might be someone else, Ukraine by itself will not change. There should be a substantial change of the external context, namely the change of the Western policy, the change of the options that the West presents to Ukraine and for Ukraine. This is why Russia insists, for instance, on the complete cancellation of any hypothetical option for Ukraine to join NATO, disregarding the fact that actually Ukrainian perspectives to join NATO are off the table right now and in the observable future. This is not enough for Russia. Russia is interested in a complete change of the context, right? In a explicit closing of the door for Ukraine to join NATO, which is the factor which will predetermine the Ukrainian development in the way which Russia considers acceptable and favorable for itself, right? So this predetermines the Russian decision to act now, the combination of this local factor, Ukraine factor, and the fundamental factor.
Okay, Dmitry, that's a good explanation. Can you let me go back to you, and then we'll go in reverse order here. But I do, I feel compelled, as we've heard so much talk of war over the last month or two. I mean, could you kind of? I mean, we've all seen the pictures. What do you think is really going on as far as the military movements and so forth? And what, I mean, if a conflict happens, how would it play out from the Russian perspective? I mean, a lot of us who have focused a lot on Russia think this would be a complete disaster for Russia and for Europe and Ukraine. But what is your worst case scenario, if you will? And then I want to ask the other panelists too.
Well, let me again agree with Vladimir Ishenko, who said that this is coercive diplomacy. Yes, indeed. This is coercive, but diplomacy, and I stress the word diplomacy in this phrase. The real chance of Russia-initiated invasion of Ukraine was zero. And there was a complete consensus on that in the Russian expert community. No one seriously considered the military escalation and let alone invasion as a plausible option. First, because it would have been too costly for Russia. And the Russian leadership tries to avoid taking costly decisions that can really hamper, that can really undermine.
Dmitry, if I may, can I just push you a little bit on this? I mean, don't you think, though, that a kind of coercive diplomacy campaign of this nature, for one, it could lead to an accidental war, right? I mean, but for two, don't you think that this severely will damage Russia's reputation, and that it will cause all of the things that Russia claims to fear here?
You have to recognize the environment in which we are living over the last 8 years. We are already in the state of systemic confrontation, which many call the Second Cold War. We are already adversaries, and the paradigm of our relations is adversarial. Right, so the Russian reputation would not have been damaged by the exercise of coercive diplomacy in the context of the Cold War going on for 8 years, already. Now we are moving into a different stage of the Cold War, which actually might be more stable and looking like détente, I hope, if we agree on certain principles and stabilization of relations. But the experience of Russian relations with the West over the last 30 years shows, and we learned the lesson, that without coercive mechanisms, we don't achieve anything, right? And again, there is a consensus in Moscow that if Russian diplomatic moves and diplomatic demands had not been accompanied by the concentration of troops, by the rhetoric of the military technical response and blah, 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 Russian demands would have gone directly to the dustbins everywhere, in Washington, in Brussels, in Berlin, in Paris, everywhere. It would have been just ignored. And the only way to cause some change, and there were already significant changes, we have started the most fundamental discussions over the European security system since the reunification of Germany, actually, since 1990. And the NATO and the United States has already changed its position on many important things like INF, NATO-Russia deconfliction mechanism. It is just because of the coercive diplomacy. But the intention to invade did not exist. It would have been completely counterproductive for us.
I noticed that both Russian papers and American papers are declaring victory today. So that's a bit odd. Theresa, how about could you help us to understand? Again, I don't want to. We're not trying to be warmongers here. I think I saw that in one of Volodymyr's articles, and it's true. We don't want to focus excessively on military factors, but I mean, look, we've all seen the pictures. We've all seen the troops flowing, American troops flowing into Eastern Europe, the weapons landing in Ukraine. Theresa, how have you kind of viewed the, as it were, did you think that a war is possible? Likely, and how did you view the European response to that? I saw different countries advocating for different kinds of solutions, others saying this is the best thing that ever happened to NATO or something like that. Can you weigh in for us, please?
For example, the annexation of Crimea gave NATO its mojo back. So in that sense, Moscow or the Kremlin actually helped NATO. And I think the situation will be the same again here, because we see two neutral countries, Sweden and Finland, concerned about the possible closing of the NATO door. So it's a catch-22, since because of principles, they say they must keep the door open. They don't ask countries to join it. Countries asked to join NATO. So they don't join unless they feel that they have this threat from Moscow. And I think that traditional countries like Sweden and Finland are now rethinking that maybe they should join NATO while they still can, while the door is still open. And this would actually add 2 more countries, something that President Putin doesn't want to see happen. So there's a boomerang effect. All the things he wants to prevent, he's actually making the situation worse in some respects, I would say. And then the other issue, I think that there's really, I mean, as the war generation dies out, people with the memory of World War II, I mean, that's becoming a diminishing pool of people. So war almost seems like in this postmodern European construction, this massive European Union experiment, the idea of war seems so kind of far-fetched to them. And now this is happening right in their neighborhood. And I think there's almost, it's hard for people to really process. Of course, they're in the same city. You have NATO and you have the EU, but they look at the world very, very differently. And I would say that these examples, you saw Borrell from really early on, the high representative of the European Union. He's kind of like their lead diplomat. He said, oh, no, there will never be an invasion. So they didn't even try to maybe conceive that this might happen. And I think that this idea of closer cooperation with Russia, they saw as an antidote to China's growing presence in their own neighborhood. So this kind of idea of if Europe can just work more closely with Russia, that's why we saw the overture with Borrell and Macron to Moscow. that's kind of fallen aside. So I think they're working on their strategic compass. Yes, the EU has a strategic compass. They're going to be publishing it soon. They're trying to come up with a strategy, and this really has put them off balance. And so this era of peace, there's growing concern now, not only about Russia, but China. And as we saw with the recent kind of pre-Olympic statement with Russia and China, I think there's growing concern about not only worrying about Russia, but worrying about the combination of Russia and China. And the other issue is deterrence. The US is kind of pushing sanctions and threatening that they'll be really, really bad. And no one wants to be too clear about what the sanctions would be, but some have mentioned SWIFT, which is a payment system. But you already see European countries like France and Germany saying, oh, we're not so keen on that. Of course, sanctions on Nord Stream 2, I mentioned that earlier. So it's not even clear that the Europeans would respond in a way that would really deter Russia, and maybe they know that. So I think it's very worrying, because the US is almost seen as the one pushing down harder, and the Europeans are not. And you probably saw in the news, Germany will not send any sort of war material to any country at war. So they are one of the biggest suppliers of arms, but they won't send anything to Ukraine. So they just made a compromise, and they sent 5,000 helmets, which became kind of a meme, a joke all over Europe. And so I think that there's really a lot of tensions within the EU, and it really works to Putin's advantage to see where these tensions are, where the hairline fractures are in the NATO alliance, and possible areas where he can, put wedges and, divide and rule.
Thank you, Theresa. Yeah, I was reflecting also on your earlier comment that, these countries have to prepare for, you use the term millions of refugees. I mean, think about that, folks. The possible catastrophic outcomes flowing from a war, are difficult to contemplate. Although one of my mentors used to say, in order to prevent a tragedy, you have to try to envision a tragedy, which is, I think what we do have to do in some ways as analysts. But Volodymyr, let me maybe can ask you to reflect on this topic a little bit. And I know it must be incredibly hard. I'm sure your family potentially there and people that you're close to. But I mean, can you describe the atmosphere in Ukraine now as I mean, again, although I agree there's some sort of information war aspect and a coercive diplomacy, but I mean, for example, in the West, there's been a lot of talk about there would be a Ukrainian insurgency. Is this, I mean, what do you think would happen in the worst circumstance, Volodymyr? Would Ukraine be split into two, or do you really just think that the whole possibility of war is just all a kind of information campaign?
Like the worst scenario is actually a nuclear world war. I don't know if it's like completely off the table, but I mean, it's not simply about Ukraine at this moment. But we should also understand the very low chances of these apocalyptic scenarios. Even if you look at Ukraine and discussing now like millions of refugees and so on. So the plans which are circulated in the Anglosphere media with these childish arrows, I mean, like the erste Kolonne marschiert and so on and so forth, is one of probably the least likely scenarios. And it's not a question of that the Russian army can defeat Ukrainian army. Probably yes, and probably it can happen in not so like prolonged period of time. But then the question is how actually to govern this huge territory with non-sympathetic population, and which Russia cannot offer that much. So we should understand that if we are discussing now like an occupation of even if just half of Ukraine, southeastern regions, even like relatively pro-Russian, that would be something like 10 Crimeas. Crimea, after the annexation, by this moment, after like 8 years, is still comparable to the poorest regions in Russia, despite huge investment, despite increase of wages and pensions. Now Russia would get 10 Crimeas. And this new kind of, let's say that would be something like Republic of Ukraine, like Southern and Eastern and Northern Korea, or as we had Eastern and Northern, Eastern and Western Germany, with the illegitimate government gathered from the people from marginal political parties, from political emigres, from the toppled Yanukovych's government, and under sanctions. And it's a huge question. I mean, the chances for a real guerrilla war, insurgency, armed resistance on really massive scale, like in Afghanistan or in Chechnya against Russian army, are quite low. The armed resistance would be higher than in Donbass in 2014, but it would be not of that scale, and it would be quite of a limited number of people, primarily the remains of the army, policemen, the veterans of Donbass war, volunteers, radical nationalists who would form the core groups of the armed resistance to Russians. But they won't be that big military factor, but more factor of increased repressiveness of the new pro-Russian regime. So you would get that the sanctions that would also affect the population, you would get a more, like significantly more repressive regime. And the main resistance would be probably unarmed and based in the middle class of the large southeastern Ukrainian cities. And now, unlike in the case of Euromaidan uprising, which actually alienated many people in Belarus and Russia, and which saw Euromaidan as a kind of like a disaster that we don't want to have in our countries anymore. And even like Belarusian opposition against Lukashenko in 2020, they were very like strongly emphasizing that we do not want any Maidan in our country. Our protest is completely different thing. But now Ukrainian resisting Russian occupation could be actually an aspiration for much larger groups within Russian and Belarusian society. And that would be a factor of destabilization for Russian regime primarily. And so this sequence of steps is so easily calculable, so that I don't believe that the chances for those apocalyptic plans are really worth to discuss.
Okay, yeah.
What Russia can do actually is try to destabilize Ukraine without any major all-out invasion, and that's what we should be concerned about.
Okay, well, you know, I would be interested in your further thoughts on that. But how about these? I want to ask the whole panel, and then I'll turn to some questions from the audience. And if you, by the way, people writing their questions, if they can be very succinct, that will be very helpful to me. I can't read an essay here, but let's talk about the diplomatic off-ramps. There have been lots of proposals floated, you know, Finlandization, things like that. I would like to hear people's different views, and maybe we could start with Volodymyr. You know, you've seen this parade of diplomats, you know, and senior officials coming through Kyiv. And also, you know, maybe you want to comment quickly on the Minsk process and give us some thought. By the way, that being the negotiating process that did begin, I think, in a couple of years ago, with a way to go forward. And you often hear different sides of the party say, well, if you just implement Minsk, what is your take, Volodymyr, on that and other diplomatic possibilities?
I think actually the diplomatic solution at this moment is still the lag list for this crisis. And Ukraine now in that situation that unless Ukrainian government would start to take more constructive and proactive steps in looking for a more or less sustainable diplomatic solution for the crisis, at some moment, great powers would just basically decide without Ukraine and for Ukraine. And Ukraine at this moment should be, Ukraine was trying to knock at the closed door of NATO. And one of the obvious result of the current crisis is that this door is even locked, is even more locked, with even more locks at this moment. And there is an evident discord among NATO. And this is one of Putin's achievements by this moment. However, this crisis ends, the question of Ukraine's membership in NATO would be only more toxic and would only more divisive in NATO. So instead of knocking at this closed door, Ukraine should look for other security solutions. And this is definitely not this alliance with Britain and Poland, which, unless these countries are going to fight for Ukraine, it's just worthless. And there should be some steps towards some common overarching structure for EU, Russia, and Ukraine. And this is much more complicated thing than finalization, because Ukraine obviously needs a much stronger guarantee that Russia won't break another treaty like Russia broke the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, signed in 1994 when Russia annexed Crimea. So we need some more complicated, more formal, more multi-layer format solutions, consultative bodies that would include Russia, Ukraine, EU, perhaps US as well, and that would create some ground for finally to dissolve in this legacy of the Cold War. And about the Minsk, Ukraine definitely needs to take a more constructive approach and to find a way that would not allow to use Minsk in order to blackmail Ukraine with the reintegrated Donbass areas. And one of the fears is that Donbass would kind of block the decisions on the central level. In fact, in the Minsk Accords, there is nothing like that, and there is no legal right for Donbass to actually block anything. But the only leverage which there may exist is a threat of an organized secession, which now would be easier than in 2014, thanks to retaining some of the administrative and enforcement structures of the People's Republics. And one of the solutions.
Volodymyr, sorry to cut you off here, but we want to get the other voices in here on diplomatic off-ramps, but we want to come back to you on Minsk as well, because that's absolutely critical. Theresa, how about you? What do you think is promising here as far as lowering tensions?
Well, the only thing that's been floated, and it's extremely flawed, is the Minsk. That's through the Normandy format. And the Normandy format is France and Germany, and then Russia and Ukraine. And so many Central Eastern European countries in Europe resent this format because they feel that the large powers of France and Germany are playing above their heads. So this is a flawed, and why hasn't it succeeded? It's been sitting on the back burner for several years. There has been no movement, and they just had a meeting recently in Berlin with nothing coming out of it. So I think that the current government in Kyiv sees it as, it was negotiated by the previous administration. There was a gun held to their head, pretty much, metaphorically, and that kind of forced them to this agreement. It bought them time. maybe tactically they agreed to it because they had no other choice. So I think that it's kind of hard for the current leadership to support it. But I think there are certain areas, especially guaranteeing linguistic, for the Russian speakers in the East. I think that's something that should be acknowledged by Ukraine. I think that that's a key issue. But there's another thing that we're overlooking here, because it was interesting how you said there are lots of locks on the door. Well, I think NATO's position is, ambiguous. It's a conundrum for them because it's a principle. They have to have the door open. But if you talk to people, everyone knows that a country that's at war cannot join NATO. So these frozen conflicts that have been orchestrated by President Putin, we saw 2008, the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics was the invasion of Georgia that created a frozen conflict. Therefore, they could not join NATO. Same thing with Ukraine. So some analysts have said, President Putin really doesn't want to settle this, because once it's settled, then technically Ukraine could join, and that's not what he wants. But I would say that most people, as long as there's a frozen conflict, these countries, it's impossible for them to join. So maybe Ukraine needs to come up with time. They need to, use some tactical moves to buy some time. And, Putin's not going to be around forever. I think the Finlandization narrative went down like a lead balloon. Nobody wants that. And because of after 8 years of war, over 14,000 casualties, there is little appetite after that kind of sacrifice to become Finlandized. And that's really seen as a pejorative term here in Europe. No, people from Finland don't like anyone to use that term. And I think that there's more, it's a big conundrum for everyone. What will the status be? So I was a student of John Mearsheimer. He said that was the first mistake, even allowing this to happen, to move this far ahead. But it's hard to tell people that your country should just be a buffer state. So I think that the idea of Europe whole and free, they had never experienced this before with the 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and everyone was just kind of playing it by ear. And so they didn't envision that would happen so rapidly and how these countries might join. So there have been different stages, different levels of countries joining. But I think that President Putin has even said, I'm talking about Romania and Bulgaria. And when you look at the map, all the countries, he wants them not to have NATO troops, not to have any exercise done there. I think it really, when people take a deep breath and really look at what he's talking about, the future of Europe, European security, it's quite frightening, I think, for everyone here in Brussels.
Yeah, thanks, Theresa. And that gets to a point that maybe Dmitry can address. There was a school of thinking, certainly in Washington, that said that Putin's demands were so extreme that they were intended to be rejected. I guess the opposite idea would be that they were kind of, extreme demands, but they would meet in the middle somewhere. But anyway, Dmitry, how about you? What do you think are the most promising diplomatic efforts that might come out of this? I think you mentioned arms control as a possibility, confidence building measures. What's a reasonable meeting of the minds here between both the great powers and those in between?
Lyle, there were obviously some maximalist elements in the proposals that Russia made, but preventing even the hypothetical NATO enlargements to the post-Soviet countries, except the Baltic states who are already members of NATO, is not one of them. And Russia sincerely thinks that it is achievable, that this is not something unnegotiable, that this, revision of the decision, revision of the statements that NATO made in April 2008 at the Bucharest summit, when it stated that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO in indefinite future, but still, that it is possible to revise this decision. because it doesn't violate the fundamental principles. It doesn't violate the open door policy of NATO. It doesn't violate even the freedom of the countries to choose alliances, right? Because from the Russian perspective, the freedom to choose alliances is not a guarantee of entering the alliances that the countries want to enter. All the decisions lie with NATO and the United States and European countries of NATO. So it is up for them to decide based on their interests, based on whether a certain enlargement contributes or not to their security, to decide whether to conduct enlargement or not. And from the Russian perspective, since we are already in the confrontational environment, since we are and will continue to be adversaries for the observable future, we have to respect the red lines of each other. Even if we do not consider those red lines as legitimate, we still have to respect them for the sake of avoiding war. That's the simple logic. Now, when it comes to the specific solution, from the Russian perspective, Finlandization as a result, not maybe as a format, not maybe as a beginning, but as a result, would be quite acceptable and stable. One of the lessons that Russia learned from the Euromaidan revolution of 2014 in Ukraine, that Ukraine will not be a participant of the Russian sphere of influence. Ukraine will not be a Russia-oriented country. It's simply impossible. But what Russia wants is Ukraine to be a country in between, right? A Ukraine to be a country not consolidated in the anti-Russian basis, not a Western fortress at the Russian frontiers, not the country which plays the pivotal role in the containment of Russia. And in order to accomplish this purpose, again, two components are necessary. A, implementation of the Minsk agreements. Yes, I fully agree with Vladimir. It will not provide the legal veto for Donbass over the decisions of Kyiv, but implementation of the Minsk agreements as they are drafted in February 2015 will produce such a decentralized Ukraine that it will be very hard, obviously impossible for Ukraine to consolidate on the 100% pro-Western and anti-Russian basis. And of course, there will be then regions, part and parcel of Ukraine, who will say, we do not want NATO membership, right? We do not want anti-Russian identity of Ukraine. We are different and we want the country to be different as well. So implementation of the Minsk agreements is absolutely vital. And from the Russian perspective, the reason why for the 7 years there have been no progress is because the West has been supporting Ukraine in its refusal to implement the Minsk agreements over this time. Now it's over, right? And we've observed a certain push from Macron, from Scholz, and even encouragement from Tony and Blinken towards implementation of the Minsk agreements. If again there is a stalemate, then there will be a new escalation. Absolutely clear, right? Russia will not relax. By the way, this temporary de-escalation is very temporary. It will depend
Dmitry,
on the pace. Yeah,
Dmitry,
it will.
can you? I think we're sort of running low on time. So if I can ask for sort of rapid fire question and response, and I'll try to summarize. I've been reading the chat and I'll try to summarize some of the questions. One of our very brightest questioners asked, what are, let's say the crisis not cooling down, Dmitry, how would Russia escalate? That's one, hold on, one question. Another question is one questioner says, gosh, Russia seems a lot like North Korea, just making a lot of noise to get a lot of attention. And then another questioner asked, these are tough questions, that says, what's the international law basis for Russia to question whether how Ukraine decides its, what alliance it's in. So can you be very quick and answer these questions?
Yeah,
and then also if you can, maybe your last thought, and then we'll go back to Theresa and end with Volodymyr, but I'll ask you each some specific questions that came out of the chat.
So Russia is not trying to revise this principle of the Paris Charter of New Europe, which claims that each country has its freedom to conduct foreign policy and security decisions. Right? Russia is not trying to revise that. Russia is not even speaking with Ukraine on this issue. Russia is speaking with the United States and NATO. Right, because this right of this principle of the Paris Charter does not entail United States and NATO, does not require, does not oblige United States and NATO to accept every country which wants to join this alliance. Right, each decision is made on the basis of whether it contributes or does not contribute to NATO security. So Russia wants NATO to recognize that enlargements to the other post-Soviet countries will undermine the security of NATO so much, right? Maybe even produce a nuclear war, that it doesn't make sense. So NATO will not enlarge, right? So it doesn't really mean that Ukraine is not free to have its foreign policy preferences. From the Russian perspective, the freedom of countries to choose alliances is a freedom to want, is a freedom to have certain foreign policy ambitions, not a freedom to achieve what you want.
Okay, Dmitry, sorry, I want to let these other voices in here because we're rapidly running out of time. If we can go over a little bit, that's just fine. But so maybe we can get you back in. But Theresa, from the chat, one questioner asked about the possibilities for the OSCE, what role they're playing. Another person said maybe Austria is the model, not Finland. Can you comment?
Yes. Oh, shoot. Oh gosh. Okay, I'm sorry, something happened. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Okay, something happened there. I had a glitch. Could you just repeat that question really quickly?
The question about OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and another question was about maybe Austria as a better example than Finland.
Okay, the OSCE, that was the third meeting that they had, and so I think that Russia just it's the only place where everyone is there. So you had all the EU member states, members of NATO, and Ukraine and Russia. So I think that would have been an ideal place, but the Russians complained that was not the ideal place. So the first meeting they had was, of course, with President Biden. Then it was at the EU level, NATO, excuse me, Biden, then NATO, then the OSCE, and they thought that was a fruitless discussion. But I think that maybe we shouldn't give up on the OSCE. I think that's important. Today, there was a new article out in Foreign Affairs exactly about that question about Austria. 1955, it was declared neutral, and that might be a better fix for this. And there's that song from Ronan Keating, you say it best when you say nothing at all. So NATO is just trying to maintain strategic ambiguity. And I would say that in Europe, there's also expansion fatigue. But I think that this kind of idea of Fortress Europe, not having these countries join them economically, we are seeing a hardening now of the European position.
Yeah, one last question. How do you praise Biden's leadership? That's a tricky one, but the American audience, I think, would be interested in your take, and then we'll go on to Volodymyr for the last word, I think.
Well, all right. What's really fascinating in Europe, so we had the 4 years of the Trump administration, and there was a huge transatlantic drift. And then with the Biden administration, he was kind of like, I'm back, we're back. And so they have been really cooperating a great deal. So people are almost complaining that they're briefed too much. They've had over 100 briefings. So they're really promoting the alliance and keeping channels of communication open. And there are so many countries in Europe now, because there is a lack of leadership. The kind of former de facto leader of Europe, Angela Merkel, who was in power for 16 years, has gone. And so there's a bit of a power vacuum going on here. Macron likes to think he is filling it, but I think that there is a craving for leadership from the Biden administration on this. And I think that, timing is everything. And hopefully, there are some that don't see him as a very strong leader, and they would actually give him
I noticed one of the headlines in the Times, I think it's Tom Friedman, said that Biden has Putin in a box. and that or in a, you know, so that's pretty interesting approach. But anyway, thank you, Theresa. That's interesting. Volodymyr, just as we close up here, and I could keep you guys up all night talking about these things. But one question from the audience came in from a very well-known Ukraine scholar in our region. How does you know, the question was essentially how to keep the far right in Ukraine in check. Do you think that they're kind of spoilers on some sort of diplomatic solution? And you know, how do you you know, how do you see the you know, the crisis playing out for Ukraine's future ultimately, if you're willing to make any predictions here? And then we'll have to close the panel, I think.
Was it a question whether the far right can spoil the implementation of the Minsk Accords? Then I mean, now Ukrainian government started to kind of like blackmail the West that we can't implement the accords because the society is going to rebel against them. The accords are not popular, this is true. However, it's only a small minority would actually protest against them. And Ukraine simply needs to ask and call for a consolidated Western position and support in implementing the Minsk Accords. And we also understand that a significant part of Ukraine's national civil society is directly supported by Western donors, Western foundations. And
you know,
in case of consolidated position, they would be discouraged to go into any unlawful disruptive actions against the line of Ukrainian government, EU, United States that would require to implement the peaceful accords.
Volodymyr, let me ask you one final question, and then I think we'll have to close the panel. But you know, I was struck when Zelensky was elected. I mean, what a character, a former comedian. Seemed to be like a wholesale rejection of the status quo, but he really was elected, if I recall, as kind of a peace candidate. And so a lot of us scratching our head going, what happened here? And how do you explain why we're on the brink of war when somehow Ukraine elected a peace candidate? What was the, how do you see that?
Because Ukrainian politics doesn't work like that. When you, I mean, and it's actually not sure if in any other country, when you elect any new hope, you get all the promises he made. And okay. Zelensky actually didn't promise that much on bringing peace. Mm-hmm. Instead of having some direct negotiations with Putin, he actually never suggested to have direct negotiations with the separatists as Russia demands. And he tried to make some progress on implementing the Minsk Accords in summer and autumn of 2019. He made a quite small anti-capitulation campaign, but quite consolidated rejection from the nationalist civil society, and he backed away. So that's how Ukrainian politics works. If you do not have any actual political party, Zelensky didn't have. If you don't have any movement on the streets in support of your policies, Zelensky didn't have. Zelensky didn't even have a coherent team behind him, and he changed the people who helped to come him power in the very first months, in the first year of his rule. So how could you even have, not simply on this very difficult question of Donbass, but on any question at all, any coherent policy? So that's an answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to thank all the panelists. I know you've been staying up late on our behalf and really educated us and put a lot on the table here for us to think about. So I wish you a good evening, and I think we're all, we're all praying for peace and hoping that the latest signals indeed show that the crisis is receding and we can move on to more constructive approaches. But this panel is really very helpful to us. So thank you so much, everyone.